I believe it is Emily P. Emily, at this point, of course, it's not, initials are not sufficient. Emily Pontecorvo, who is going to talk to us about navigating the 21st century without vision. And Mike, we are rolling? Excellent.
Take a picture, or is that inappropriate? Can I take a picture, or is that inappropriate?
Take a picture. If anyone turn the right side up, Shannon, by all means. My son, I've just sneaked it.
No. Hello. Oh, no.
Let's fire up the projector.
So I'll just say that I really wanted to take advantage of the program's money and like go to Hawaii or something, but I just didn't end up finding a story that took me anywhere like that. So I wrote about technology. My thesis is called Navigating the 21st Century Without Vision, and it's about assistive technology for the visually impaired. I mainly focused on that population. And I'm just gonna get started. So this is Jerry Barrier, and he works at the Perkins School for the Blind over in Watertown in Massachusetts. And Jerry's kind of famous. He is obsessed with birds and nature, and he actually worked with the Audubon Society to develop, to add accessibility features to their nature trails so that a blind person could walk down the trail and be outside in nature completely by themselves and have access to that kind of experience. But what I want you to notice about Jerry is that he's holding up a smartphone. And I don't know about everyone in this room, but 9 months ago, I had no idea that blind people used smartphones. They have buttons, and when I heard that, I was surprised because I didn't know that there was a way to kind of access a phone in a different way. And so I want you to know kind of how Jerry feels about his phone.
The iPhone is one of the most magical, wonderful devices for a blind person that has ever been created.
So my thesis is about why the iPhone is so magical for blind people, how it really changed digital accessibility, and what the problems in this space are today. So before we talk about the iPhone, I just want to go back and give you a sense of some of the things that Jerry and other blind people were working with before this type of tool came around. So I'm sure you guys are all familiar with Braille. And one thing to understand about Braille, it's a fantastic tool, but Braille books can be really big and heavy and clunky, and it's not the most kind of portable technology. There's of course the white cane, which came to prominence in the 30s, and there's a few different models of the cane, but at its base, it's really an unbeatable form of technology. You can't really improve it, except for maybe a guide dog. Some people do prefer that method, but we're gonna come back to the cane in a little bit. In the 1970s, Jerry was using this thing called the Opticon, which I just love that name. And it was basically really cool. It was this little camera that he would glide along a page with one finger, and the other finger would sit in this little trough, and the camera would send vibrations to the other finger in the shapes of the letters. So he could read just regular text using this. And he said this was revolutionary for him. But it was also really, really expensive. This thing cost like $20,000 at the time. And there were other tools similar to this in the 80s, but they were all similarly like the cost of a car. And so then in the 90s, when personal computers came out, there was this thing called a screen reader. And this was a really, really big deal. It's a piece of software that you can download onto your computer or put it on with a CD. And it basically narrates the contents of the screen out loud. And so here's what Jerry said about screen readers. Oop. Oh no.
When the personal computer came along and they developed a screen reader that would work with it, it just changed the world, changed my life literally.
Oh, it's okay.
Because before that,
Can you guys hear
I
it?
couldn't look things up in the dictionary. I couldn't research things without somebody reading for me. So when I started to be able to use the computer, it was, oh my gosh, it just literally opened up the world.
And even though this is just software on the computer, JAWS was also really expensive. In 2006, it still cost about $1,000 for this software. And then this is jumping forward. Today, there's a lot of really cool solutions. This is a Braille note taker. This is a modern version, but these have been around for a while. And this hooks up to your computer, and not only can you use it to type, but it also, along the bottom, there's something called a refreshable Braille display. And basically, when you hook it up, you can, instead of using a screen reader to listen to the contents of the screen, it will send text to the refreshable Braille display in Braille form, and you can read it line by line that way. So you don't always have to just listen to everything on technology. But these still cost, they can cost anywhere between $3,000 and $5,000. So you get the theme here. There's cool technology, but it's expensive. And people in this population aren't exactly the most wealthy members of our society. Employment is kind of, it's been very low in this community for a long time. And then there's just one more point I want to make, which is by the early 2000s, there were all these different devices that could help with very specific tasks. So this is a barcode reader. It could scan a can of soup and tell you what type of soup it is, or you can make customized labels. There's a color identifier, a GPS device, a money identifier. You have all these different things for different tasks. And then in 2009, when the iPhone 3GS came out, this was the first touchscreen device to come with accessibility built into the phone. And not only that, it was really the first mainstream device that he had even considered the fact that non-sighted people might want to use it. And it came with Apple's screen reading software. So they had already developed a software that came on the Mac computer, but this is the first time that they put it into a mobile device. And this meant that a blind person could take the phone out of the box and just start using it immediately. They didn't need any additional tools or to spend any additional money. And over time, they've added a lot more accessibility features to it. Like there's, you can make the text larger. There's different swipes that you can do to do things more expediently. And as much as we all resent having our phones, this was really amazing because basically the iPhone can do all those things that all those specialized devices were doing. So the barcode scanner, there's an app for that. The color identifier, there's an app for that. You get the idea. There's apps that can do all these things all in one device now. But I just want to stress that the significance of the iPhone was not just in replacing all of those clunky devices. For decades, there really wasn't crossover between assistive technology and mainstream technology. And if you had a disability and you wanted to use a mainstream device, you needed some additional thing. And so here was a mainstream company saying, making this piece of technology that, now to be a part of modern society, we all kind of need one of these things. And they actually took the time to consider that not all of their users would be able to see the screen. So when I first started learning about how blind people use iPhones, I learned that there were all these great apps that the visually impaired use to help them. And I wanted to talk to some people about how they use their phones. So I met this woman named Winter. She's a musician here in Boston. And when I sat down with her and I asked her to tell me about all the cool apps that she uses to help her in her life, this is what she said. It's my clock when I wake up in the morning, and I'll check the time on it. I do that too when I wake up in the morning. If I'm gonna make food and it's something I haven't made before and I wanna look up a recipe, I'll use it just to do that. I do that also. I like to look up recipes on my phone. I use it for schedules if I'm going to go somewhere, so I don't have to stand and wait for the bus forever. I can come out when the bus is coming. I literally do that every day. So you get the point. All the best things about the iPhone for Winter and for many of the people I spoke with are the same things that make it convenient for all of us. And yes, there are disability-specific apps, but really the best things about it are the same conveniences that we all have. So if anyone has never seen VoiceOver before, I just want to do a quick little demonstration of what it's like. So if you were ever interested in using this feature, you would go to your iPhone and you'd go to Settings, General Accessibility, and there's tons of different options. So I turned it on, and
Messages. 5 unread messages.
So I have 5 text messages right now.
Tap to open.
Double tap to open. So
Messages.
let's go look up the weather.
Unread
So you'd swipe.
FaceTime. Spotify. Google. Weather. Weather. Cambridge. Cloudy. 56 degrees.
It's really lovely outside right now. You get the idea. And so, most people who use that feature, they turn the speed of the voice up to like 90% so that it's just like weather, and they get used to understanding it that way. Okay, so then there's a few other features that are pretty cool. There's like a Braille keyboard so that you can use the phone to type that way instead of verbally texting. So we now have this interface that makes almost anything accessible to blind people. And there's a lot of people developing new assistive technology apps for the phone that they hope will make the lives better of people who have visual impairments. But one of the big things that people are trying to figure out is creating better solutions to help blind people navigate. And so one example this is Roberto Manducci. He's one of the first people I spoke to, and he's working on an app that would help a blind person find their way inside of a building. So when people are outside, they have their cane, they have a GPS system or a dog, or they're familiar with their route and they know they can manage that situation. But if you go to a building you've never been in before, it's pretty rare that the building will have like a Braille map to kind of figure out where they need to go. And GPS systems obviously don't work inside buildings. So a lot of people are trying to figure out what are different ways that we can improve that experience. And so Manducci was working on a backtracking app. Basically, it would count your steps and keep track of your turns so that if someone showed you the way to the doctor's office, you could then find your way back on your own. But when I first talked to Roberto, one of the first things he told me was about this pretty embarrassing mistake he made when he first started working in this field. And I'm going to have him tell the story. Oh, God.
We wanted to replace the white cane with a very cool laser cane that would discover the distance to objects and would tell you if it was step in front of you or something like that. Very bad idea. If you talk with anybody who is a proficient user of a white cane, that's what we call a long cane, they will tell you, don't bother. The cane works beautifully. It is cheap, it's robust, doesn't have batteries to replace, always works. That's the problem with engineers. We tend to start with the technology.
Try again.
We tend to provide solutions and then we look for problems.
So that's the problem with engineers. They tend to find solutions and look for problems, is that last line that he said. So this is Erin. She is the Access Technology Director at the San Francisco Lighthouse. And one of the things she does is that a lot of people who are working on these types of tools will come to her and ask her for advice or ask her to assess their new idea. or find test users for their new products. And I asked Erin what are some of the common mistakes that engineers like Manducci make when they try to make new apps for the blind. And this is what she said.
I mean, the biggest thing people get wrong is making an idea based on, like, they saw one blind person somewhere that maybe they didn't even talk to. Like, they designed based on their fear of, like, how hard it would be to be a blind person, versus talking to blind people and finding out what the needs of the community are. What we see a lot, kind of when people come to us with new ideas, is like everyone thinks that there need to be new devices or apps for safety. Like, oh, we're going to make something for you that will vibrate when you're near objects and you can press a button to call your loved one for help. Like, there's a perception that, like, blind people need some sort of almost like medical alert type of device, and that's not really the case. So often, those are the types of ideas where I go, ooh, build something else.
So just to sum up what we've talked about so far, earlier on we had specific devices for every task that cost a lot of money. We had people like Roberto Manducci trying to reinvent the wheel with the white cane. We have people coming to Erin trying to fix problems that aren't actually problems. And then there's lots of people that aren't considering accessibility at all. So they're designing apps that don't work with VoiceOver, for instance. There are some success stories. This is Microsoft seeing AI, and I think this is sort of like the crown jewel of assistive technology. It really does everything. It does all the things in those devices that I crossed out earlier. It can read documents, it can scan barcodes, it can identify money, all of those kinds of things. There also are a few navigation apps that people like to use. They do use like Google Maps and Apple Maps, but often people will use those at the same time as one of these because these apps will give them more information. So they might tell them about things that are on their way or what type of intersection they're approaching. And the thing is that navigating, if you think about it, it's not always about getting from point A to point B. If you are walking down the street and you need a new toothbrush, you might notice the Walgreens on the corner and walk in and buy a new toothbrush. And if you didn't need a new toothbrush, you'd probably not even clock that Walgreens at all. You wouldn't know that it was there. And so this is really one of the challenges with building a navigation app is that people want to know what's around them, but they don't want to be totally bogged down with, you don't want an app that's going to tell you about every single store that you pass. You want the relevant information. And that's really hard. But there is one company that has sort of solved this problem. It's called IRA, and it stands for AI, Artificial Intelligence Remote Assistance. And so it combines artificial intelligence with human assistance. And it connects blind people through a smartphone app with trained agents, and they're basically available 24/7. And so when you call them, they get a direct feed to your phone's camera or to glasses that have a camera on them. And they can pretty much help you with anything that you want, like if you dropped something and you need to find it, or if you need help navigating. A lot of people like to use this for airports because to get from one gate to another between flights can be a challenge. So a lot of people really, really like this new solution, but it's still not really an ultimate solution because there are privacy concerns with having a camera on in public places. And there's also this, what some people described as a generosity cost. Every time you need help with something very basic, like I dropped my keys and I need to find them, having to call someone and say, oh, hello, please, will you help me, and thank you, could be exhausting. So you wouldn't want to use this for all the different times that you might need a little bit of assistance. So despite some really cool things that the iPhone has made possible, it's also provided a lot of new opportunities for the visually impaired and people with other disabilities to get left out. And so one really common thing that happens is that an app might be accessible one day, and then an update comes out, and then the company forgot to test their code with VoiceOver, and suddenly it doesn't work anymore. So this is Chauncy Fleet. She's a blind advocate that lives in New York City, and she tweeted that the latest update to the Lyft app breaks access to the request ride button. And a lot of blind people that I spoke with really love ride sharing. Like, it's a very convenient way for them to get around. And so it just sucks that you're relying on this app to get around, and suddenly you open it one day and it doesn't work. And it's just for you. It only doesn't work for you. It works for everyone else, but just not for you. And that really sucks. This is Sassy Outwater. She works here in Massachusetts. And she told me that Google Maps was really bad, and then it was really good, and then it was bad again. And so you really just can't rely on a lot of these apps. And so she really pushes people to develop adaptability and flexibility and basic skills using VoiceOver, and not really rely on any one thing. There's just a couple more points, which is that when mainstream technology is designed for a full range of end users, those are really the best solutions, much better than these specialized apps and devices specifically for the disabled, because Apple has a robust support team that if you have a problem, you can go to the store, you can call them, and they're there and they'll help you. Whereas a lot of these more specialized apps, they go out of business, or they have a small support team. They don't have a lot of time or money or resources to fix things when they break. And the other thing is that designing for people with disabilities is just good design. Everyone has a disability. Sometimes is one thing that people said, if your hands are full because you're carrying groceries, or you're losing your vision because you're aging, making apps that kind of think of these things will help everyone. But it's not just the apps. I'm almost done, I promise. It's not just the apps that are unreliable. There are still so many things that are not accessible, and the Ally movement is really trying to improve all of these different realms for people with disabilities. So things like appliances, microwaves that don't have Braille or don't have any kind of voice cues, washing machines that now have touch screens and don't make any sounds, exercise machines, websites. So Beyonce was actually sued in January because someone who was blind was trying to buy something from the store on her website and couldn't, because her website wasn't coded in a way where they could use the store with VoiceOver. And so there are a lot of lawsuits that are happening, like actually thousands per year are going around the courts. And some courts are interpreting the Americans with Disabilities Act to say that websites need to be accessible, some aren't. And so this is still an ongoing thing to kind of keep an eye on. And then I just want to finish by saying, when these companies are getting sued for their websites not being accessible, or I talked to some developers about whether or not they consider accessibility, and a lot of the excuses are, oh, it's too expensive, it's time consuming, they never considered it, that's not their desired end user. But really we have to acknowledge that it's culture. And here's something that Erin said about this.
If people are sitting around thinking about how to stop blind people from running into things, it's like, they're not going to hire me, right? Because they're afraid of me, if that's the problem they're trying to solve. So that is, society's still kind of stuck on either, pity or inspiration, and hasn't in some ways moved beyond that.
So I just want to finish by stealing the words of another person I spoke to who said, in any story about technology, we have to acknowledge that any changes we make in technology pale in comparison to the changes we make in society. That's it.
Questions?
Thanks very much. That was a great presentation. It was interesting, and especially the angle of concern around the digital divide. We often think of digital divide as a class problem, but it's a physical problem for people that are blinded. As I listen to your story, I can't help but wonder if there's an opportunity for sensory-based interactive technology, like MIT's involved in things like Internet of Things, whether these smart sensors. I'll give you a couple examples. One, you could pull into a parking garage in an airport, and before you even get in the garage, it tells you how many parking spaces are available and where they're at. and it can tell your car what level and spot to drive to. I was curious why like major retailers don't have anything like a digital storefront. So we think a digital storefront is sighted people by something like Amazon Web Services, or going on Amazon and shopping. Why can't retailers have like some sensory technology that broadcasts to blinded people's iPhones that tells them like there's a CVS in 50 paces, rather than using the software that's is not like, so the information on their map may not be able to tell you whether that store's open right now, whether it has a toothbrush in stock. Is there any opportunity for sensory devices that you came across that would help navigation?
Yeah, so the first thing you brought up about Internet of Things, that's actually, a lot of people I spoke with see a lot of potential in the Internet of Things, in having smart devices around, especially one example that came up in my thesis is if we start to have, so Aaron talked a lot about having smart trash cans. Like if we have trash cans in a public space in cities where it notifies the garbage company to come pick it up when it's full, or if we have tags on bathrooms that notify the city when the bathroom needs to be cleaned or needs more toilet paper, those tags could potentially help a blind person who needs to find a bathroom or needs to throw away their dog's poop, or just knows where that thing is and wants to get there. The thing about that is that those products aren't being designed for that purpose or for those people. So in order for that to become useful to other people, the companies have to open up their data and allow a third party to then use that data to create a new app. So for example, I use a transit app that accesses Boston's Metro real-time transit, but it's not owned by Boston Metro, but Boston opened up their data and allowed that app to be created. Does that make sense? Do you know what I'm saying? So like this trash can company would have to allow some other company to come and say, okay, we want to make this data available on like a map interface.
So does anybody believe in that discussion for accessibility standards?
There are, I think, the IoT sphere is so young, and companies there are, someone told me like, it's rare that you would find an IoT company that's more than 3 years old. And so these companies are just trying to figure out how to make products that anyone wants, let alone thinking about accessibility. So we're really not there yet, unfortunately. There are, so one IoT thing is that there's something called a Bluetooth beacon, which is basically like a little sensor that some places this is a solution for indoor navigation, so they might put up a beacon at the entrance to a building and then throughout the inside of the building, and then have an app that will use the signal from those beacons to help you navigate the building. And so some people are trying that, but the issue with that is that those things have to be kept up. You have to replace the batteries, you have to make sure they work. And so it creates extra work for the building.
With the sort of technological leap that you described with the iPhone 3 coming out, do you have a sense at all of whether that had an impact on employment rates for people who are using these accessibility features?
Yeah, that's something that I really wanted to know, and I didn't really get a good answer on that. Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know the answer to that.
Did you get a sense of how much of this could be market-driven and how much of it really needs to be sort of done out of some kind of social capital? Whether, you get the question, I'll stop there.
Yeah, I think there is a market-driven component. I mean, there's about, I think the visually impaired population it's a small percentage of, at least in the United States, I think it's like 3% or something like that. And so this is obviously not a big market. But with tools like the iPhone that have these features, it's really not, I got the sense at least that it's really not that much additional work to kind of basically beta test your app and make sure that it works with those features. And so I really do think that it's much more culture than it is market, but that's my take on it. I will say, I know one thing that a lot of people want to know is why Apple did this, and I didn't really get a good answer on that either. One person, she was convinced that this was just Steve Jobs' vision. Steve Jobs wanted everyone to be able to use his products, and so he made sure it happened. Another person kind of hypothesized that there was a period of time where iTunes was being threatened with a lawsuit for not making their educational, like their iTunes University material accessible. It didn't work with VoiceOver. And so the National Federation of the Blind was threatening to sue them, and they basically came to a settlement where Apple agreed, okay, by June of next year, we promise that all of our iTunes University materials will be accessible. And by June of next year is actually when this iPhone came out. So it could have been that pressure that was put on them by the National Federation for the Blind.
I had a quick question. So the law is always grappling with technological advances. The ADA is obviously a super old statute. Have you looked into, is there a lot of new legislation coming out sort of addressing disability type concerns, especially in the realm of technology developments?
There was some movement, and then it was all like tabled by the Trump administration. I can't remember the exact specifics of it, but there actually was a bill people were trying to pass to update the ADA to include things like websites, and it was just put on hold. Yeah, but there is, if you are interested in keeping an eye out on this, there's a lawsuit against Domino's right now, and people think that it might go to the Supreme Court next. So we'll see. Yeah.
Have you found that the smart assistants like Alexa and Cortana and Google are starting to replace VoiceOver, or is VoiceOver used pretty exclusively?
Well, so they're kind of different things. VoiceOver basically helps you navigate through an interface like your phone, whereas something like Alexa is something that you do voice commands to, so you like tell it what to do and it does things for you. So VoiceOver like reads things back to you, and something like Siri is like a voice command. And what's interesting is that something like Alexa or Siri is actually, that technology kind of originates in accessibility or in assistive technology, because the original use of this was kind of this voice to speech, speech to text kind of, or text to speech, speech to text technology. But yeah, they're kind of separate. But one person I spoke with was really adamant that like voice command driven technologies like Siri and Alexa are really the future, because it kind of takes the hassle of navigating a device out of the whole equation.
Is there one particular feature that they are requesting next? I mean, now that they have this magic device?
I think it's...
In general, was there a consensus that you heard?
I was really, I went into this project being like, I want to know, like, what do people want? What is, like, the perfect navigation solution? What is, like, the app that will change people's lives? And that's, like, the wrong question. Like, it's like, we want websites that work. Like, I want to be able to fill out a form and know where the submit button is, so I didn't just waste an hour of my time. I want to be able to open the Google Maps app and actually use it. So it's really just more about wanting consistency, wanting to be considered.
Okay, once again, thank you, Emily. Next up, taking us on a trip to scenic Asbestos USA, Gina Vitale.
Oh, I'm sorry.
clean it. Oh, yeah, it was perfectly clear to the audience. Very nice. Some things in there that aren't in the thesis. Some of the things you mentioned were not in the thesis. Or maybe it was just mentioned. Yeah.
Try again.
Or Alexa, I do not understand that.
No? Is this okay now? Great, cool. I'm Gina. Today I'm going to be talking about something that we've all heard of, but maybe don't know as much about the history of that we think we know. And my presentation is called Asbestos USA. There it goes. And it's about a little town called Ambler, Pennsylvania, which was once known as the asbestos capital of the world, and is now grappling with the waste that was left behind from that. So I don't know about you guys, but I like a little bit of an interactive portion of a presentation. So we're gonna do a little game. So this is Clara Barton. She's the founder of the American Red Cross. This is Billy the Kid, who escaped from a jail in New Mexico. And this is President James Garfield, who was assassinated. Does anybody who's not seen me rehearse this presentation know what these three pictures have in common? Wants to guess? Dad? No? So these events that I described, the American Red Cross, Billy the Kid escaping, Garfield being assassinated, those all happened in 1881. And those are all things that you've probably heard of happening, and there's something that's a little bit lesser known that happened in 1881, and that's this guy. This is Richard Madison. He was a pharmacist in Philadelphia. He was one half of the company Keesby and Madison, which sold pharmaceuticals in Philadelphia. And one day he was, I don't actually know how he discovered it, but somehow he was working with milk of magnesia, who some of you of prior generations may recognize as a certain pharmaceutical purpose, usually taken when having abdominal troubles, and quickly relieve those problems. So somehow Madison, the pharmacist, discovered, and I won't go into detail about the process, but discovered that milk of magnesia and asbestos could actually be used as a really great insulating material. And he and his business partner, William Keesby, decided to cart up their whole operation and move to a little town by a railroad track in order to sell insulation material because it was more profitable than headache medicine and laxatives. So this is what that idea became. This is the Keesby and Madison asbestos factory, and at one point produced a huge proportion of the asbestos products that were in the United States. And at the time, this little area was called Wissahickon Valley, after a river that ran through it. And a few years after Keesby and Madison got there, it was actually renamed after a woman who heroically carted a bunch of medical supplies to this event, which was the Great Train Wreck of 1856. And her name was Mary Ambler. And so the town where Keesby and Madison set up shop became known as Ambler. And what I'm here to tell you today is basically the story of Ambler, how it came to be the asbestos capital of the world, and basically where it is now and what's happened to those people who have lived there. So that's one story. But there's a more important story, and this is the story of me. So that is me as a young child, covered head to toe in asbestos. I'm just kidding. It is. It's snow. My mom was like real mad there for a second. As a kid at this age, I did not know that much about asbestos. I knew that it was bad. I knew that it made people sick. And really what I've learned is that asbestos is this kind of umbrella term that we use to describe a bunch of minerals. And when we say asbestos, we're pretty much referring to just this kind, which is white asbestos, also known as chrysotile asbestos. This is found it's found naturally. It's not something we manufacture. It is in clusters of rocks, in mountain ranges. It's usually mined. And it presents kind of like this in thin, wispy spiderweb-like strands. And while you can see this, obviously, the individual fibers themselves are so small that they can't necessarily be seen. And that's really part of the problem. So that leads me to the only other thing I knew about asbestos when I was a kid, is that it has something to do with mesothelioma. And I knew that from, this is a picture of MASH, the cast of MASH, which is my favorite TV show. And I knew about mesothelioma because of those daytime TV commercials that would come on during shows that were targeted towards older audiences. And they would say, you know, if your loved one has been exposed to asbestos, you may be entitled to a settlement for developing mesothelioma. And at the time, you know, it was kind of a joke because I didn't know what it was, but it's incredibly serious to me now, and that severity is not lost on me because, as I learned, asbestos fibers, because they are so small, they actually lodge into the lungs. And it's particularly devastating because over the next 10 to 20 years or several decades, a shell will slowly grow around those fibers and grow around the lung itself until you can no longer use those lungs to breathe, which is a really horrible death, and it's absolutely devastating and something that I really wasn't aware of the magnitude of until I started researching this. It was very common among people who worked with asbestos in the factories. So you might be thinking, like, this is horrible. There's no way that Keasbey Madison knew about it when they made their huge asbestos factory, and that's possible. I don't know what they knew or what they didn't know, but there are records going as far back as ancient Egypt that people in general did know that asbestos was causing terrible disease. There were records of slaves falling ill and dying after working with asbestos as a construction material. So say what you will about whether people knew about it at the time, but it's sort of a flimsy excuse. But anyway, returning back to the current day in Ambler. So 1970s comes around, the EPA is like, oh man, asbestos is bad. Everyone kind of realizes that. Most asbestos factories, including the one in Ambler, are shut down. EPA through the 80s and 90s comes, does a bunch of cleanup, removes, you know, there were like 100-foot high mountains of asbestos that were known as the White Mountains in Ambler. Those get, you know, trucked out. Everything's pretty much fine. And then in 2005, something really interesting happens as someone who owns a portion of land in Ambler that used to be an asbestos waste pile decides to build a high-rise. And they want to build 17 stories of homes directly on top of a bunch of asbestos waste. And there's a woman who heard about this who lived in Ambler for 20 years. Her name is Diane, and she's one of the most incredible sources in my story. She was like, this is outrageous. She and a group of people who I can't name all of them here, but fought very hard to get this prevented. And they went out and collected signatures. And ultimately, that wasn't working, so Diane basically said, I am going to run for office myself, and I'm going to fix it. So Diane Morgan became the first woman and the first Democrat to be elected city comptroller for that township. She got the signatures she needed, and she basically got that building site to be declared as a special environmental designation by the EPA. And that designation is what is very fondly known as Superfund. And that's important because that means when a site is identified as a Superfund site, that means there is special funding for it. That means the EPA has decided this is a priority. This site needs to be cleaned up. It is a danger to human health. And so that was a big win for Diane and for the people that she worked with. But the second thing that they really advocated for after that was to get all the asbestos removed from the site. And that did not happen. And there's a few reasons for that. So basically the first option, or the most obvious option for removing the asbestos, was to dig it all up and truck it all out. And one of the main reasons that did not go forward is because in order to do that, you're disturbing a lot of fibers into the air. And even if you really thoroughly tent the area, even if you wear masks, because asbestos fibers are so small, there's always a danger of inhaling, and they decided it was just kind of too risky for the community. The second option is something called in situ joule heating or vitrification. This is basically a chemical process. It is not like this. This is just a picture of glass blowing, but it turns it turns asbestos into glass. I couldn't find like a common rights picture of that. So basically, it's melted into an effectively harmless material. Thing is, there was a lot of asbestos, and this is very expensive. It was around $250 million. So the government decided, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So ultimately, they went with kind of what they thought would be the best option in the first place, which was a soil cap. So basically, several thousand cubic yards of asbestos were capped with 2 feet of, a geotextile was laid down, 2 feet of clean material and 6 inches of topsoil were placed over it, and basically grass was allowed to grow. And that site, which is known as the Beauret site, if I refer to it in the future, is in 3 parcels now. So there's 2 land parcels, and there is a waterfowl preserve where birds come and like bathe and eat and stuff, and it's very pretty. So that leads me to asbestos panic. So you might be thinking, this is really bad. Like they're just capping this asbestos. There's a ton of asbestos down there, and that's really concerning. And that's honestly how I felt when I first learned about it. But it's important, not to sound too journalism-y here, to look at both sides of this issue. The term asbestos panic comes from a 1990 Science magazine paper that basically said the asbestos movement has been overblown. There's a lot of danger in removing it. Maybe we should just kind of leave it where it is, not really disturbing anyone, usually like in shingles or in schools that are being remediated. And there are much more present dangers, especially to kids, like tobacco. Someone that I spoke to brought up the fact that she's much more concerned about her daughter riding her motorcycle. She's not worried about her going to go take pictures of the old factory site, but she's much more worried about things like car accidents, where statistically are incredibly dangerous and the consequences are incredibly immediate. Whereas asbestos, it kind of depends how much you're exposed to, and it also has a really long latency period. So the danger is not as present. I talked to someone else in the town who expressed something similar, basically saying that things like pesticides and environmental toxins, those should be the environmental priority in Ambler right now. Asbestos, it's been dealt with pretty thoroughly. We don't need all this vitrification and digging stuff out and everything. So it's important to recognize that while Diane and her colleagues bring up important points, there is another side, and it's not really my role to tell you which one I believe in or which one is right, but hopefully I'm accurately presenting the nuance to this situation, because it is something that I struggled with a lot. And that leads me to my next puzzle game, which is, these are 3 birds. And let me tell you, folks, if you like birds, you're going to be in for a real treat with Brittany's presentation. But this is like a little taster. This is I don't know if I'm going to get these right. I think this is a sharp-shinned hawk, a egret, and a great blue heron, I believe. Does anybody know what these 3 birds have in common, other than that they are birds? Migratory? Probably. I don't know that much about birds. You'll have to ask Brittany. They have all been self-reported by citizens on a website called ebird.com to have been spotted in the Ambler Waterfowl Preserve. And I mention that because of a statistic that I found particularly alarming. So the EPA's job is one of the EPA's jobs in regards to this site is to take measurements to determine the levels of asbestos in and around the site, and that includes in the water. So there's 2 water sites that they sampled, and in one site, basically they have a goal level for how much asbestos is safe, and then they measure the asbestos actually to see how far above or below that goal it is. So in the first water site, it was 5,000 times greater than the goal identified. And in the second water site, it was 20,000 times greater than the goal identified. And just fun fact, the first time I tried to reach out to the EPA, as you have heard that our research took place in January. You may recall that was the longest government shutdown in history, so that made it incredibly complicated to get any kind of answers to these questions. But basically, they were very kind, but they were very bureaucratic. And basically, the answer that I was given was that, number one, there's other possible sources of asbestos that could be elevating those numbers, like, for example, like debris from the nearby train track could be getting into the water. But their answer was basically that the goals they had set had been too ambitious, and they should have made them easier to meet and more reasonable. And that sounds silly, but it's actually kind of scary, because it either means that the thresholds that they identified, the goals, were so inaccurate, like so ambitious they were off by a factor of 20,000, or it means that the goals they identified in the first place actually were correct. Those actually are the thresholds for health, and we're just 20,000 times over them. And to be fair, this is not for human health, this is for ecological health, but if you are like me and Brittany, you think birds are really important, and I'm concerned about the animal welfare there, and I think it's whichever one of those options it is, whether the threshold is off or whether the asbestos level is off, or whether the asbestos level is too high, I think further investigation is really needed there. And that leads me to kind of something that's not really environmental, but something that Winifred Curran at DePaul University referred to as strategy number one. And this is kind of a story that I stumbled into as I was doing my environmental reporting in Ambler, and I didn't expect to have any kind of social or socioeconomic impacts of this reporting, but it felt, and I did not have as much time to investigate it as I would have liked to, but it's something that I felt really important to include, and that's the fact that in West Ambler, there is a predominantly black community of lower socioeconomic status who has lived next to this Borit site, this asbestos site, for a significant amount of time, but now that the site is beautiful and grassy and has a waterfowl preserve, there are anecdotes from one of my sources of basically landlords refusing to fix stoves, hot water, things like that. These could be families, people with children, absolutely being neglected so that they can basically decide to move out of their homes. The conditions can be made so unbearable that they will leave so that people who are willing to pay more rent can come in and support this whole gentrification cycle. And basically these families who have been next to all this asbestos now that it's cleaned up are being priced out and gentrified out. And that's, again, something that wasn't my original focus, so I didn't have enough time to look into, but it's a very serious impact socioeconomically, and it's important to remind ourselves that in environmental waste sites, it is often far beyond an environmental issue and is, in fact, often a class issue and a race issue and an issue of socioeconomic status. And that's something I'd like you to take away from this that I definitely didn't know coming into this research. All right, we are at the final 3-picture puzzle game. This is who I incorrectly referred to as Princess Meghan Markle last time. She's actually a Duchess. Thank you, Emily. They got married in 2018. This is the campfire in California. And this is Brett Kavanaugh, who was inaugurated to the Supreme Court. Does anybody know what these 3 pictures have in common? I kind of gave it away, actually, by accident. They all happened in 2018. And something else happened in 2018. You're kind of used to this bit by now. This happened. Basically, a government representative afforded $1 million to Winpain Township, which is the township that basically runs this site or owns part of it. And the money went towards what they call their West Ambler Revitalization Plan, which, as you can see in this article, includes plans for a Boys and Girls Club. And this is directly on top of the remediated site, on top of the soil cap, to build a basically community space for young children of the community. And to be fair, the EPA would have to approve this, and it has not been officially approved, so it is not officially going forward, but there is kind of a severity to it. The fact that there is $1 million that's been devoted to it, it's certainly not enough for the whole project, but it does signify kind of a seriousness to it, in my opinion. And the reason I mention this is because, like I was telling you before about the water measurements, the EPA also measures the asbestos level in air, and they have goals for that too. So measured at adult height, the asbestos level in air on the particular parcel of land where they would build this is safe. It is under the threshold. But at child height, it is, so the threshold is 0.04, and at child height it is 0.07, or I'm sorry, it's reported as less than 0.07, which according to my EPA source, means it's probably less than that, basically. And there is no guarantee of how much less than that, or if it's, there's a whole 0.03 difference between 0.04 and 0.07, whether or not it falls above that threshold or below it. It's not really been made clear to me. There's a high chance, according to the EPA, that it is under 0.07. But basically, what they told me again was that there is so much variability, apparently, in this test that it could well be safe. But curiously enough, the adult height was considered under the threshold, and that same argument is not being made of the variability. There's no question of, oh, it's so variable, the adult height could actually be unsafe as well. So in this weird situation, variability only works one way, and only the child height accurate data might be dangerous. I'm sorry, not accurate data, but child height data. And also, again, told me the goals maybe were too ambitiously set, and maybe should have been made easier to meet. And again, I'm not qualified to make the judgment of whether or not that asbestos level is dangerous, but again, there is either an issue with the EPA's thresholds, with their incredibly variable equipment, if there is so much variability in this that they can't definitively say these measurements, or there is actually a problem with the asbestos being too high. And I don't know which one of those answers is correct, but I know that that's a problem that needs to be solved, and for the sake of the children that will be on this community, I hope that it is solved soon. And I do honestly really feel for the people of Ambler and have a real concern for them. So to conclude, I want to read a little passage from my thesis. So I said, while the EPA has been looking at purported certainty in the data, I've been looking at the maps. I've been looking at Libby, Montana, where waste from a vermiculite mine that once kicked up about 5,000 pounds of asbestos dust has also largely been covered in soil. I've been looking at Stratford, Connecticut, where an automotive part manufacturer named Asbestos, the slogan was the best in brakes, dumped asbestos waste not only on their own facility, but on at least 46 residential properties, wetland areas near the Housatonic River, and more. On the 34-acre site of the facility, they installed a soil cap and put in a shopping center. They buried the waste and built a Walmart. I've been looking at Klamath Falls, Oregon. I've been looking at Victorville, California. I've been looking at Colts Neck, New Jersey, and I've been looking at all of them. And I've been wondering how many measurements are variable like this one, or purported to be variable like this one. And I've been wondering how many creeks have an asbestos level 20,000 times higher than is safe for the animals living in and around it. And I've been wondering how many low-income African-American families might be priced out or mistreated out of their homes because the toxic waste they used to live next to has been covered with dirt. And in Ambler and across the world, there is dirt left to dig. It is heavy, it is old, and it is toxic, but that doesn't mean it can't be done. So I want to close with a few parting thoughts that I would like you to kind of take with you and remember if you have any takeaways from this presentation other than all my really good jokes. This is a quote that someone told me that really hit me in Ambler. I asked her why she still lived there, if she thought it was unsafe, and she kind of brought up this idea of there is asbestos like everywhere, and it's really hard to get away from, like all the places I just named. And she basically said, where am I going to go? And actually ended up building a house in Delaware. And these are the 3 takeaways that I'd like you to remember. Asbestos is still legal. Last month, against the advice of scientists, senior officials at the EPA enacted a rule that only restricted asbestos rather than banning it. That was very recent, and it was a big story. And most uses of asbestos have still not been banned in the US. So I want to thank you all for listening, and I also want to take a minute to thank my wonderful advisor, Toby Lester, for helping me through this whole process, my parents for driving all the way up from Philadelphia, my class for pretending to laugh at all my bad jokes all year, and especially the residents of Ambler for opening their community to me and telling me about these stories.
Questions?
Thanks for this. So this seems like one of those cases where the personal was political. And I had a conversation a couple weeks ago with someone who was talking about the Black Lung Compensation Act of 1973 for coal miners. I was astonished to hear that that was during the Nixon administration. And also that, and now sort of making the connection between the awareness of asbestos and that also the awareness of black lung disease. I'm wondering if you have any sort of retrospective on what was going on during that era, what it was that enabled those concerns to bubble up, and why black lung was prioritized over asbestos, because as far as I know, there's no asbestos, similar compensation act. And well, I guess that slide sort of says what's going on now.
Yeah, I mean, you need in the Nixon era, how it was able to bubble up. Yeah, I think that kind of the 70s, not to make light of it, but kind of the flower child kind of hippie movement that happened around the late 60s and the 70s really kind of brought to light a lot of environmental concerns. I think people really started to embrace this idea of the earth kind of as a person. And that led to a lot of research that wasn't really formally talked about. And this led to this kind of huge environmental movement. And I think that allowed the things like, the black lung and the asbestos movement. I think black lung probably, I'm just speculating, but if I had to guess why it took priority, I would say probably because I believe coal miners is a big source of black lung. I've also heard of like firefighters developing black lung, and those are kind of two professions that are still really ongoing. People don't generally work in asbestos factories anymore because there aren't really any anymore. But yeah, they're definitely, both are huge issues. Both have a long latency period, I believe, and I think there should be a compensation fund for people with mesothelioma and asbestosis as well.
The cynical side of me wonders if black lung was to justify the strip mining.
I do. Yeah, I do have a large cynical side with a lot of questions about this. So.
Hi.
Hi.
Great talk.
Thank you.
It's lovely. I love, when you were mentioning the issues that come with the income inequality side of this thing. What would you think would be like the next step in like reporting on the differences in low-income communities?
Yeah, I think having had more time, what I would have liked to do is really, so I talked to someone who is kind of an advocate for those people, and I would have really liked to talk to those people directly who were in those situations, try to talk to their landlords, and probably local law enforcement to see if anything had been done about it, and really firsthand try to understand their experiences better. And also, in terms of fixing the problem, the source I spoke to at DePaul University talked about basically grassroots movement can have a big impact on combating gentrification in this kind of situation, a small town kind of situation. And I don't know if there's been any kind of organization to that level, but I think, and I have no idea what that community is thinking, and I don't want to speak for them, but maybe if they could get some support to do something like that, where they could have some kind of organized protest or have some kind of advocacy for them. I know a lot of them don't have the resources and the time, or I believe, but yeah, I definitely would like to see something go forward with that. And I think more reporting definitely would be amazing on, not just the environmental side of these issues, but on the socioeconomic fallout that happens with them. Yes, staff?
I just had a couple questions. I think my first exposure to asbestos was, I remember being in kindergarten in 1964. Back then we still practiced air raid drills, and you put your head down on your desk, and that was pretty common.
Yeah.
However, in Philadelphia, my building was built like around 1900, and we would have to brush this white dust off our desks because it would fall from the ceiling, and they used that for insulation. So I think a lot of people were exposed to asbestos, and it's just more wide than we recognize. Maybe you don't see it as much today, but certainly for my generation. Since the EPA is able to keep moving the line on the changing the standards or recalibrating, I was curious, have they been effective at all in remediation? And I started to talk about the EPA. It reminded me of the 9 most terrible words. I'm here from the I'm from the government. I'm here to help.
Right.
Have they helped anything? Have they fixed anything?
That kind of what comes into the other side of the argument is that there are a lot of people who feel that the cap has been enough, and the general consensus has really been that the soil cap absolutely helped. That action was certainly much better than leaving the asbestos waste there. Provides a lot more protection than that. It's really now a question of how much is enough. And some people do feel like that was completely enough, and some people don't. And what it kind of comes down to for me is the data and whether or not the tests are saying that it's safe. And the reason it's hard for me to make that evaluation is because the EPA is kind of so bureaucratic about whether or not the thresholds actually should be taken as they are, whether or not they actually are above limits or not. And I think if we can make that data kind of much more black and white, like what is safe and what is not safe, I think that's the only way we'll ever really be able to have an answer.
I didn't see another hand, sorry.
This is a possibly dumb question, so just heads up.
No such thing.
What is technically considered child height? Just if you happen to be short, just want to check.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Are they
No,
talking
I think
about
that.
little kids or like?
Yeah, no, this is a big issue for me because I can't usually reach gas pedals in like cars without like pushing the seat all the way up. So like I totally feel. I don't remember the exact number for child height. I believe it was something like 3 feet, but I can go back and check. I believe adult height was somewhere between 5 and 6 feet.
What about the ground? I mean, the kids are tumbling, lying on the ground.
Yeah, if you can get the EPA on the phone to give you like a straight answer about that, I would love to see it. But I agree with you.
So I was wondering if you spoke with anyone from Ambler and if they ever expressed, their perception of risk that asbestos, related disease or, their environment. Because you said earlier how in 2005 someone planned to develop on top of the site, and that kind of spurred people to, investigate it. If that hadn't happened, then I wonder would they have even investigated it. So I was just curious, do the people feel like they're safe in their environment or,
Yeah, that's a really good question. The woman I talked about, Diane, and the group of people she works with is in advocacy. They obviously don't feel it's safe. And they certainly would have advocated for it sooner, I believe, but Diane at least did not even know about the asbestos waste until that building was proposed. And that's the reason it only started for her then. And she lived there for 20 years and really had no idea of the history. And so I think issues like that give a kind of urgency to it do help. But that's a really valid question of, if there never was this proposed building, would this movement have ever happened? Would it ever have gotten identified? And that's kind of scary to think about. And I didn't have time to mention this in the presentation, but actually the reason that site didn't get built, that 17-story high-rise, was not because it was identified as a Superfund site. It was because of like a zoning technicality that you couldn't have a building that high. And so that, left the door open for this Boys and Girls Club to be built. And the people who were in charge of that high-rise actually went to prison for tax cheating, but it's kind of a separate issue.
I had a follow-up question. I'm just curious if the EPA is using science against us. So they said that the soil cap is 2 feet. I just find that unusual. That's essentially like a landfill. 2 feet's not very deep, and when we take the deceased and we put them 6 feet under and they're harmless, why is 2 feet good for something like asbestos?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There is a geotextile cover before the 2 feet, and then there is another 6 inches of topsoil. But yeah, there's a kind of a what my source in the EPA told me, or one of my sources in the EPA, was that the proof is in the pudding, basically. So they had done that technique prior in another site in Ambler and basically hadn't had any issues with it. So they're kind of continuing the practice, and they said most of the research has been that kind of practical observation. And I in my full thesis, I actually mentioned the study that I identified as the soil cap being based on scientifically is actually based on a study done in clay fibers in soil. It's not based on asbestos fibers, which I found to be really insane. And it's also, I think, from the 70s. So basically they are using just this observational justification, I think, to make that judgment.
Hey, Gina.
Hi, Tom.
I remember from long ago, in my earliest reporting days, catching a couple of the early stories about the sort of acute epidemiology around Brooklyn Naval, World War II Brooklyn Navy Yard workers and so forth, where I think some of the first asbestosis and mesothelioma connection was established. And in that late 70s, early 80s period of the science and the reporting, people emphasized that these cases were acutely connected to these really acute exposures. You'd be welding asbestos into a ship day after day after day for 3 years, and then 20 years later you'd show up with these terrible diseases. And I'm wondering, whether much or any science has been done, even at the sort of most basic epidemiological level, on exposure to these sort of large, when you're not actually cutting into something, or when you're not at the point of attack on asbestos, if you're living next to a pile of asbestos, what is the epidemiology of that? Has there been work in Ambler or elsewhere that shows that there really is significant risk that comes from that less acute exposure?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's different, there's obviously like the OSHA regulated level of asbestos for if you're working with it directly, and I believe a different standard if you're in a nearby community, but that is something that I think is not well enough understood. Basically, people understand, like, sure, if I'm working with asbestos every day, I can understand that risk, but what is my risk if I'm next to a lot of asbestos? What is my risk if I'm 2 miles away from a lot of asbestos? And that's something that I think much more research should be called on for, or at least, I'm not aware of a lot of research on that, and I think not only that, but I think public education would be really helpful in that area, because a lot of people, like Diane didn't know that she was living next to an asbestos waste site, and until I started this research, didn't know that asbestos was even legal. So I think furthering that knowledge would be really important.
Hi. Kind of a related question. So the EPA is obviously the main player here, but are other federal agencies getting involved, like the Department of Health and Human Services and OHRP? Like, is there research being done on these people living in these towns? Long-term research studies?
Yeah, there are some research studies in the University of Pennsylvania right now about Ambler in the surrounding community. The PADEP, the PA Department of Environmental Protection, is pretty heavily involved. But as far as I can tell, the EPA is kind of the, at the forefront of it, and we're my main point of communication. And I'm not sure how independent those other agencies and those other studies are. But yeah, I'm sure that there's a lot of other agency involvement, and that's something I would love to look into if, given more time on this.
Yeah, and just sort of a related question, and this might be outside the scope as well, but did you run into how other countries are dealing with this and legislation in other countries and approaches there in terms of environmental remediation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I did not have a lot of time to look at internationally, but it is worth noting that asbestos is illegal in a lot of other countries, and it is kind of strange that the U.S., as such a developed country, still allows it in so many products. And yeah, I would be really curious to see how they handle specifically this kind of like site level remediation, like whether they do a full removal, whether they also do soil caps or like something like a vitrification process. I think that would be fascinating. And honestly, when I started out this project, my goal was to be like, I'm going to look at all these places that have asbestos waste, and I'm going to, put them all together. And really, there is just such a rich story in each place that I found that it would take a full team of reporters to really do that kind of in-depth examination of all the sites across the country and the world. So, good question.
Again, thank you, Gina.
Thanks.
Now, from one of the oldest materials humans have used to one of their newest inventions, Future Talk, Madeline Turner.
I can't have caffeine anymore, except in the morning. If I have anything after 3 o'clock, I'm up at night.
I generally sleep in the afternoon. But there is still that I can go out and get nice cash.
I'd be up all night. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah. You had that initial sleep, but then you wake up, your eyes fly open at 2 or 3, yeah. Yeah. It only gets worse.
Don't say that. I know that to be true.
I'm the Scrooge of Christmas future.
Hey everyone, my name's Madeline. The title of my thesis is Future Talk, the race to build bots that gab like humans. So, my thesis is about a strange and exciting piece of technology, a chatbot. So first off, what is a chatbot? It's a computer program that can talk with people, either through text or out loud. It's a vague term. People also call it voice computing or voice assistants. You've probably encountered a chatbot before if you've ever used Siri or Amazon Alexa. There's a few other famous examples, including Eliza, which was built in the 1960s. It was a very simple text chatbot that was styled after a Rogerian therapist. There's a lot of smaller chatbots out there. A lot of hobbyists make smaller chatbots themselves. So in short, there's a lot out there, and they live on all kinds of devices, from Internet of Things like fridges and Barbies to our phones. But I decided to focus on one chatbot in particular. This chatbot is named Gunrock. It is named after, it's named after this thing here. So Gunrock is a computer program with a voice, so it can speak out loud. She is designed to hold conversations on pretty much any sort of basic topic that you would, something you would talk about with your coworker, like sports, movies, science, news. A team of students at the University of California, Davis created Gunrock. And Gunrock is named after their mascot, so that is the UC Davis Mustang mascot. I think it rivals, what's the scary orange one? Gritty. Yes. I think this one is scarier. And it's funny too because the mascot is a boy horse, but then the chatbot is a girl. There are 11 students. They're getting their PhDs or their masters in computer science. They spent almost the entire year in 2018 building this chatbot. It was part of the Alexa Prize, which is a yearly competition put on by Amazon. Students from all around the world submit their chatbot ideas to the company, and 8 student teams receive funding to pursue their idea. So the point of the Alexa Prize is to build a social bot that can truly converse like a human. This is a huge research challenge, one that we haven't been able to meet yet. And I'm going to talk about the actual technology and its capabilities at the moment in a minute. But I wanted to point out one thing really interesting for now, which is Gunrock, along with the other 8 chatbots who participated in the competition last year, were cast over every Amazon Alexa device that is out there over the spring and summer. So hundreds of thousands of people were able to talk with her. And the reason I focused on Gunrock specifically was, so she won first place in the Alexa Prize. And even though there are a lot of other voice computing technologies out there, she's a great case study just because the group of students who worked on her, they were really new to working on this kind of project. They went through a lot of great trial and error, and they learned some surprising things about how people responded to the technology. And in general, we're going to see more technology like Amazon Alexas, and not just things that are focused on commands. We're going to see chatbots that are really, truly conversational. And so this is sort of an important time to look at this stuff because soon it'll be a bigger part of our lives. Okay. Finally changed the slide on the thing. All right. So I'm going to read a short passage from my thesis. It's important to demystify and define chatbots. When people hear the word, they often think of customer service. Visit a company website at any hour of the day, and a chat window materializes to say hello. This simple program, simulating a human customer service rep, appears outwardly helpful. Its job is to steer you, the customer, to say or type specific commands and questions. For store hours, please write hours, it writes, invariably punctuated with an emoji. If you stray from its script, or if you're a hopelessly bad speller, you might get frustrated when it doesn't respond in a rational way. If this kind of bot shows any glimmer of intelligence, don't be fooled. It's definitely fakery, or a human service rep taking over. But in other cases, chatbots do much more. Amazon Alexa is like a brighter cousin to these annoying customer service bots. Her main purpose is to ask questions and perform tasks in a chatty way. Researchers within industry and academia continue to hone the technology needed for a computer to understand the human voice and rebound with a rational response. Technology like Alexa is still far from perfect. When I told my sister about researching chatbots, she asked what the point was. Eventually, they're going to be people's friends? It's possible. Many people have the same question. Unfortunately, some bots exist solely to deliver personalized customer experiences at scale, as one venture capital firm put it so bluntly. Basically, a lot of this tech exists to sell us stuff, and it's masked as a friend giving us an innocent recommendation. But some chatbots serve different purposes. Wobot, for example, is a much-hyped iPhone app that mimics a cognitive behavioral therapist. Another chatbot-like program is embedded in Hello Barbie, a doll that uses speech recognition technology to talk and play games with kids. Gunrock and the Alexa Prize in general do not have a specific purpose. Rohit Prasad, the vice president and head scientist at Alexa AI, likens the prize to the DARPA Grand Challenge, the competition to build and race autonomous vehicles funded by the US Department of Defense since 2004. In early years, not a single vehicle completed the course, but the competition and its multi-million-dollar rewards spurred important research. And the Alexa Prize exhibits really striking parallels to the Grand Challenge. In the past 2 years, not a single chatbot has reached the prize goal, which is to sustain an intelligible conversation for at least 20 minutes. And that sort of leads us to our next question. How do they move the technology forward? How will they get a chatbot to actually talk to us and sustain a conversation? So designing a chatbot is a very open-ended research question. There's lots of ways that you could go about it. One way that has received a lot of buzz but doesn't actually work very well yet is using machine learning. what it would involve is designing a computer program to sift through a ton of conversations until it forms certain rules about language. So it could, in theory, come up with its own sentences basically by scratch. The technique works in simpler scenarios. So if you have a computer and you want it to identify objects in a photograph, you could use machine learning to do that. But language is so complex that researchers haven't really figured out how to do that yet. And instead, Gunrock, as well as most chatbot makers, use partially handcrafted basically, they partially handcraft their bots. They spend a lot of time building these sentence templates. It's basically a skeletal structure of a sentence with blank spaces that can be filled in later based on what the Amazon Alexa user just said. So for example, if you say, chatbot, how do you feel about cereal? The chatbot can say, cereal is awesome, and so on. And it obviously gets more complicated than that. So here the point that I'm trying to drive home is it's not magic. The technology isn't, literally intelligent. It doesn't have a brain. But that doesn't mean it's not complicated or that it's unimportant. It's definitely a precursor to some of these more advanced techniques like machine learning. Okay. Does anyone own an Alexa? Cool. So you probably know, you can say, Alexa, what's the weather? You can look up a recipe. But she isn't conversational. She isn't going to talk about sports or current events. And she's definitely not going to bounce back and forth in conversation with you. But Gunrock is a completely different program. It's accessible through the Alexa device. Anyone who wanted to talk to one of the chatbots just had to say, Alexa, let's chat. And it basically toggles from the normal Alexa program to one of these chatbots that they're testing out. So over the course of the competition, Gunrock was able to have over 400,000 conversations with Alexa users. And over time, the grad students could look back on these transcripts and basically see what worked and what didn't and try to improve their bot. So I'm going to play some times when I was talking to Gunrock, and you're going to see how weird she is.
Madeline, so, did you know? I love to travel. Do you like to explore new places?
I love exploring places. Where's your favorite place?
I like to travel the internet. So, which was the last city that you traveled to?
Osaka.
That's a lie.
I'm not entirely sure about that. Do you mind talking about something else?
I don't mind.
Which city are you going to visit next?
Tokyo.
Ooh la la! I recommend you visit Tokyo Skytree and Tokyo Disneyland.
Okay, I'm going to play one more.
I'm hungry. Do you want to talk about food?
Sure.
I can't even explain how much I love food. One bite of my favorite food on a bad day can totally change my mood. People tend to change their preferences over time. Are there any foods that you wouldn't eat as a kid that you eat now?
I eat Brussels sprouts, and I never ate Brussels sprouts before.
Brussels sprouts? You have a good taste. How often do you have Brussels sprouts in a week?
Okay. So, you can see she's a little bit goofy. She obviously doesn't sound like a person, and she clearly doesn't understand what I'm saying. But she's also momentarily captivating, and at least in my experience, I really wanted her to sound coherent. Like I almost felt like I was playing pretend, like I was really talking to a sentient being, which was just an odd experience. Oh, okay. And that's partially the point. So Amazon wants to develop, Amazon and I'm sure other companies want to develop this technology that actually is personable, that can relate to people's emotions and can really mimic a human relationship, and that's because that's a profitable thing to do. Basically, the more likable and engaging these programs are, the more likely it is that people are going to talk to them. And there's all sorts of reasons for why you want that. The main thing is, if you spend more time talking to this bot, you're generating more data for that company. And so Team Gunrock, like every other chatbot team last year and the previous year, really spent some time trying to give their chatbot a personality. And so far, it's done in this hilariously superficial way. So Gunrock specifically is a 29-year-old woman from Seattle. Her favorite musician is Taylor Swift, and her favorite actor is Leonardo DiCaprio. Her favorite food is orange chicken from Panda Express. I tried to draw it there. What I read that as is a grad student's favorite food is orange chicken from Panda Express. And one team member actually wanted her favorite music genre to be EDM, and they had an argument about whether whether that was mainstream enough, would people get what EDM was? And there lies a conundrum. So if you make a chatbot too niche, you risk alienating people. But on the other hand, if you make a very bland bot, you're not going to please people that way. It's sort of this rule of trying to please everyone makes something inevitably universally hated. So this is sort of building a personality. This is something that researchers struggle with, and it's only going to get more complicated once they move past these superficial likes and dislikes, and they're really working with things like naturalness of voice and sarcasm, and just things that actually make a personality. And then when I was doing my research, I wondered if there were any ethical concerns associated with this new technology. And one thing I ran into over and over again was this idea of algorithmic bias. So what a chatbot says is either a reflection of the designer's beliefs or a reflection of data fed into the program. When Gunrock says anything, she's pulling information from several data sets. These data sets are taken from the internet, including places like Reddit and Twitter. And obviously, what's coming from those websites. It's things that real people posted. And people on the internet are only human, and humans are imperfect. So the data reflects our biases. And so what was really interesting is the people talking to Gunrock, you could clearly sense that they knew that the words Gunrock was saying were coming from somewhere. And they were kind of suspicious about it. And they were really eager to test her out and just see if they could call her out and if they could perceive any bias or something they disagreed with personally. I'm going to read another short passage. Over the summer, Gunrock interacted with many Alexa users every day. Kevin Jesse, a first-year PhD student, often saw a few thousand conversations running in a single moment. As these conversations poured into the system, students analyzed the transcripts. They searched for moments when Gunrock carried the conversation, and more importantly, moments when users wandered away. Quickly, Team Gunrock learned that what is pleasing to the user is not always obvious. Early on, if someone brought up a sensitive topic, like elections or guns, the students wanted their bot to cautiously engage. But even so, conversations about divisive matters quickly fell apart. People didn't actually want to talk about immigration or other tough subjects, even though they were the ones who instigated the conversation. Really, they just wanted to test the bot. They wanted Gunrock to give them a satisfactory answer. one that confirmed or at least did not challenge their beliefs. It was more of a checklist, Jesse said. They would say, "Are you a libtard?" And we'd say, "Oh, I'm actually not a Republican or a Democrat." And they'd say, "Okay, good." And they'd be done with the conversation. We had a lot of users that would just say, "Donald Trump," and that was it, he added. So there's this perceived bias from users, and then on the other side is this legitimate potential responsibility for chatbot designers to take into account like what they're putting into their bot. They have to make certain decisions when they pull, content from these data sets that are coming from Reddit and Twitter. In Team Gunrock's case, they do take certain precautions. So they make sure to run these filters that filter out any bad words. And so, that's like a very rudimentary, it doesn't catch everything because some bad stuff is contextual. And in general, algorithmic bias is a very nebulous thing. It's subject to the eye of the beholder, what is actually wrong and right. When I talked to Team Gunrock, the PI, her name is Jo Yu, she was really optimistic about overcoming any hurdles presented in the future in terms of algorithmic bias. And to me, as someone who is bound to use this technology but does not have a hand in creating it, this sort of optimism felt like, this response felt like an unsatisfactory answer. I did hear some interesting things from a couple students. So there's one data set from debate.org. So it's people arguing their opinions on different topics. And the people who tend to use debate.org are mainly male. And it's just interesting how this chatbot, which is taking arguments from this website, like the chatbot is a female character, and then it's a male perspective. So that's just one example where, in the future, it's something the researchers would like to look at. And I have one short quote from Kevin Jesse again. "It's interesting because our bot had a female persona, and a lot of the content that we relayed probably had male bias to it. If we can do it again, and we would definitely analyze that more, maybe this year." So in the end, oops, okay. Last summer, at the end of the competition, 3 judges sat in Amazon's headquarters in Seattle. They tested all the bots. And surprisingly, Gunrock placed first. And there were some really sparkly moments for Gunrock. And then there were other times where she completely bombed. So one judge asked her, "I saw a movie over the weekend. I don't think you're going to guess what it is." And then she would say, "Oh, you saw a movie last week. I heard it was good." And they just go on and on like this without Gunrock truly answering the question. And when I first heard this, I was initially disappointed. I went into this project thinking that this was this magical technology and it was so advanced and honestly more capable than it is currently. But that's okay. The thing is, there's just this momentum behind the research, especially with the Alexa Prize, that makes it sort of inevitable that the technology is moving forward. And soon we're going to see, these voice assistants and chatbots are going to become a more ubiquitous part of our lives. So we might laugh at them for now, but eventually they might laugh at us. All right, thank you.
Questions?
Thank you so much for mentioning Eliza. It brought back such memories. We played with Eliza when I was in graduate school in the 1970s all the time for entertainment. And compared to Alexa or Siri, it was really crude because basically it was just a psychotherapist. Because all its responses were pretty canned. How do you feel about that? And, oh, that's interesting. And tell me more. or so whatever you put in, its phrases would sort of fit.
Yeah.
So, but we had lots of fun with it, and you couldn't talk to it. It was all on the screen. And I just checked on Google. They actually, you can play with it there. It's out there, so you can sort of reproduce what it was like. But that was fun. I was interested though in the response about Tokyo. Sounded like marketing. Now, are they mixing that in, that Tokyo Disneyland pays a little for having that as part of the answer anytime Tokyo is brought up?
That's a great question. So specifically with Gunrock, the answer is no. They don't have full control over what the chatbot says because they're just pulling all this random information and trying to match it with what the person just said. So I said Tokyo, and then in this vast data set, it's like what Tokyo, what, and pulling something random up. But like in the future, that is something that could happen. Like you could definitely monetize, the chatbot and have it come up with recommendations. Yeah, so.
Hey, is there any concern over, like, if they're pulling data from Facebook and Twitter and stuff like that, that's supposedly other humans? Like, we all know that that's not totally the case anymore.
Yeah.
So is there any sort of research that they're doing or like trying to figure out if the things they're pulling from are actually humans, or do we just have
like
bots
other
teaching
bots.
other bots?
I don't know if there's a lot of information out on this, but that's actually such a great question. I don't know if you've heard this, but there's like stretches of Twitter that there's a word for it. I think they'd call it like dark Twitter, and it's literally only bots talking to other bots. There's no real humans, and like if you mapped it out visually, it's just this like cloud of just not people. And I kind of doubt that's happening because I think it would just be a lot of noise, but I don't know for sure, and I don't know if people know really what's going on with that. Yeah. And I should also say there's like, it's not just taking anything from these websites. Like, for example, on Reddit, they're using certain subreddits, and they're trying to use the nice PG subreddits. Yeah.
So I actually have two questions. The first is about ownership of the conversations, of the data from those kind of conversations. Of course, Google owns the data about our searches, and Mattel owns the data that the children who have conversations with Hello Barbie had. Obviously there's questions, different types of questions there, right? Whether it's a subpoena for, a divorce case where a parent wants to know what the child was talking about, or whether it's metadata for an advertiser. So the first question is just whether you can say something about whether there are laws that are developing to regulate who owns and can own, and what sorts of information need to be given to the users of the chatbots about who does own it.
I actually don't know if there are any specific laws being created to address that. And that's actually such a fantastic question. Like I would be curious about that myself. I do know, there's certain, for example, like with Alexa, you can go back and delete the audio of your conversations with Alexa, and that gives people this false sense of control, but your transcript is still going to the company. So I don't really have an answer for you, but that's really interesting.
And then the second, just real quick question, if you don't mind, is about the underlying concern about who these chatbots learn, not just the rules of English or whatever language from, but also the implicit beliefs that are embedded in those linguistic norms. There was a Microsoft chatbot that was put online for 2 weeks in 2016, right, Tay? That was taken offline because it was tweeting all kinds of racist really, putrid stuff.
Yeah.
I guess my question is, I can see how we could put a language filter for certain explicit forms
Exactly, but-
of, hate speech or whatever, but implicit, so if you have something like, it's Ramadan now, right? Muslims celebrate Ramadan. That's a categorical statement about Muslims that does not seem problematic. Are chatbots going to be able to distinguish between that kind of statement and statements such as Muslims and then say anything else you want to say?
Yeah, that is such a good question. So overall, for any implicit message, right now they do a terrible job figuring out how to filter what should be filtered and what should be said. And basically the bot can filter out bad words, but it does not pick up on any context. So they were looking at the transcripts and someone was talking to Gunrock and being like, I want to touch your grandma's thigh. And there's no words that would I had it reversed. Gunrock said that. And there's no words that you would catch and block it, but it's obviously something you don't want a chatbot to say. So yeah, that's a huge research challenge and something they totally haven't figured out yet. And they're actually having a lot of problems with it. So so Tay, the chatbot on Twitter, the crazy thing is they created a second version of Tay. Her name is Zoe, and I think she's on Facebook Messenger. But she's kind of a worse version of Tay because she doesn't spew hate speech, but if you ask her something about your example with Muslims celebrate Ramadan, if you say any sentence with the word Muslim, she says, I don't want to talk about that. So things that are totally benign, she shuts them down. So yeah, which is in some ways just as offensive. So yeah, they have done a terrible job with that so far.
I was wondering, just because there's getting into a lot of talk here, at least at MIT, within the CCL department, of the certain distribution and use of particular technologies, and particularly when you're talking about AI and machine learning and all kinds of that, because it can be used in malicious ways. And I was wondering if sans research purposes, a lot of what you're talking about is obviously in the intents for research. Is there any sort of rules that are allowed for people to use them outside of research purposes? Because I know there have been instances of people using chatbots to phish information from people, their credit card information, or to fake them out and scam them. And so I was wondering, are there any laws that restrict the use of this kind of technology?
I really don't know. I mean, I would assume just scamming people in general is illegal, but I don't know if there's a specific thing that targets chatbots.
Hi.
Hey.
On the social media side of things, in terms of privacy, I was just wondering, so if I have a Twitter and my Twitter is on private, or you can't see anything I post until you follow me and I accept it, and then I post something and hashtag something, and then that would appear on the page, would a bot pull from that even if, would Gunrock pull from that information even if I was on private?
My understanding is if it's private, then they would not be able to use it. I don't think it shows up, but I would have to double check to say for sure.
This might be a little more technical than what your interests were in, but I was just thinking about what you said about neural nets not having been terribly effective in terms of making efficacious chatbots yet. And I think that there are some applications like facial recognition where neural nets have been super effective. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a little on what the technical limitations are that are preventing this technology from getting better?
So I don't know if it's preventing it from getting better. There was, so I think, I don't know if I'd really be able to explain it in a like accurate way, but like I just know there were other chatbots. So the year before Gunrock 1, there was a chatbot where they used pretty much only machine learning techniques and not any sort of like template sentence. And for whatever reason, that chatbot tanked. And yeah, I don't think I would like be able to describe why, but just that's what I've heard from multiple people, that it doesn't work yet.
Great presentation, very good topic. I had a question around whether you came across any social impact or social economic impact of using chatbots. So in the industry that I'm in, chatbots are being targeted to replace people in contact centers. So chatbots provide answers to people. And instead of hiring a person that knows this subject, that subject, and their knowledge consists of 1,000 questions, that can be programmed and replaced. Those people are going to be replaced and displaced as part of a social impact. I was wondering if, aside from Gunrock, which was like, I guess, an academic experiment, was there any social impact that you came across or identified?
I really focused on this particular competition and sort of the work being done to like push this technology and not really focus yet on like its applications. But I think you're right. Like I'm assuming that, you know, having a conversational program could replace a lot of labor. So I think that's something people will see in the future.
Once more, thank you, Madeline. And to conclude the festivities, let us look at the conservation sacrifice with Brittany Flaherty.
How did you make yourself?
I drew them and then I take a photo of them, and then there's like an app and I can, like, it's like a paint bucket thing where you just
You can
tap
colorize it, so you just make sure that all the outlines are complete. That's really cool.
Hello, everyone. All right, well, I know I'm last of the day, so thank you for sticking with me here. I'll try not to talk about birds for too long, but as Gina warned you, I do like talking about birds. So we'll get started. As I said, my name is Brittany, and I'm here to talk to you today about conservation in New Zealand and why it looks quite different there than it does many other places on Earth. And so to get started, this is New Zealand. I picked this map because New Zealand's front and center here. And that's actually pretty rare. There's an entire Reddit thread dedicated to maps that forgot New Zealand, which is sad. But also, I think part of why that happens is, as you can see, New Zealand's really quite isolated from most other major land masses, Australia being the closest one, the closest continent nearby, but still quite a distance away. And it's been like this for quite some time. New Zealand broke off of the supercontinent that included Australia Around 85 million years ago is when it started to break off, and I believe around 65 million years ago is when it was separated. So that's around the time that we lost the dinosaurs. So New Zealand has been on its own out there in the South Pacific for quite some time, and that allowed the wildlife there to have this really unique opportunity to evolve without too much connection to the outside world. And next thing you should know is that New Zealand is not Australia. People tend to confuse the countries, confuse their accents, and also confuse their wildlife. So if you go to New Zealand, you won't see any kangaroos, any koalas, and actually before humans arrived in New Zealand, you wouldn't have seen any land mammals at all. So not even the sheep that we so associate with New Zealand of today. You wouldn't have found any of that. And that is because there are no land mammals that are native to New Zealand. So aside from a couple species of bats and seals, no mammals at all. And so that gave the wildlife, again, this chance to kind of thrive, those animals that didn't have the presence of some of these predators. And so without mammals around, you can see who really took over New Zealand, and that is the birds. And as you can also see here, there's some really unique birds in the country. They have about 200 species now that are native to New Zealand. Many of them are endemic and found nowhere else on Earth. And many of them have adaptations because of the lack of mammals, such as flightlessness, that make them really special. So the kakapo in the bottom right there is the world's largest parrot. A lot of places call it the fattest parrot, but I'm not going to use that word. And the takahe in the top middle is this really cool ancient species that's also flightless. And then, of course, the kiwi, most famously, one of New Zealand's flightless birds. And so these species, in addition to being flightless, have other adaptations that that adapted because of the lack of mammals, including nesting on the ground and laying their eggs on the ground. And this is because most of their predators were raptors like the hashed eagle that you see in the top right, was one major predator. When predators are coming from the sky, another adaptation that they developed was to freeze when they sensed a predator, which is a great strategy if an eagle's flying overhead. So the kakapo will completely freeze if it senses a threat, but it's not such a great strategy if you're faced with something on the ground. And over the past few hundred years since humans arrived in the country, they've introduced a lot of mammalian predators, and they have been able to take out these species in huge numbers because they are, excuse the bad joke, sitting ducks, just laying their eggs on the ground. And so the predators can both attack the animals themselves and get to their chicks and eggs really, really easily. And so New Zealand's lost a whole lot of birds. About 60 species are extinct and no longer seen. So perhaps most famously on the top right, the moa were these really large ostrich-like creatures that were wiped out mostly by hunting, and the hashed eagle as well. But then recently, some of these mammalian predators have wiped out additional birds, including the huia, which you see here. And even the ones that have not been wiped out, their numbers have been decimated. About 25 million birds are killed each year in New Zealand, so they've taken a huge hit, and most of the species are considered at risk or threatened. And the culprit is clear for this. It is these mammalian predators, and there are a few that stand out as especially problematic. The brush-tailed possum, the rat, and the stoat. In no particular order, because depending on the species you're talking about, which one is the most problematic shifts. But these are the three main culprits, and as you can see, they look very guilty. They know what they've done. They've been wiping out birds like crazy across New Zealand, and so the country has decided to do something about it. So I'm going to read a passage from my thesis about that. Poison traps and shotguns, words not often spoken in the same breath as conservation. But in New Zealand, wildlife protection looks quite different than it does in most of the world, all because of a deep-seated connection to their feathered fauna. The country is home to more than 170 bird species considered at risk or threatened. Like the shore plover, many of these birds are found nowhere else on the planet. The culprits behind these losses are clear. Invasive rats, stoats, and possums, and other mammals have decimated their numbers. To many, it's a choice, birds or mammals. To save one, their best option at this point is to wipe out the other. Conservation in New Zealand is all about killing things, said Mick Clout. Killing some things to save other things. killing mammals to save birds. Over the past 5 decades, predator control has reduced or eliminated mammalian pests in patches across the country. But the bird losses continue. Pests kill 25 million native birds each year, and that's a conservative estimate. Nearly 60 are gone forever. It's become clear that more drastic measures are needed to save New Zealand's birds, and in response, the nation is taking their pest elimination program to a globally unprecedented new level. Their goal, eliminate all rats, stoats, and possums by the year 2050. And so as you can hear, they've set this really enormous goal in New Zealand to get rid of these 3 animals by the year 2050. And that was something that really caught my attention, and that was really what I wanted to explore in this thesis, is kind of what got them there and where they're going with this goal. And so the original inspiration for my thesis actually came about 10 years ago when I studied abroad in New Zealand. I went down there, I was studying environmental science, and I signed up for a conservation trip, and I thought we were going to be like hugging penguins and mending their wings and doing other sorts of fantastical environmental things. And it turns out our goal for the weekend was to kill cute fuzzy animals, which I did not see coming. And so these are some pictures I actually took from that trip. And as you can see, a stoat there that got caught in a trap. And all we were really doing was baiting traps in this one area where some rare penguins nest. And so we're trying to help them have a chance of surviving another breeding season. And so this was really eye-opening for me. And I decided that it would be something worth exploring over the course of this year. And so I wanted to find someone who could tell me more about what conservation is really like in the country. And I found Hazel Speed, who has a wonderful name and an even better personality. And she absolutely adores birds. And when I spoke to her on the phone here in Boston, she said, "You just have to come to New Zealand. I'll show you all the cool birds." So I knew I had found my woman, and I was able to go out in January to New Zealand, which was pretty incredible. It was almost exactly 10 years since I'd been there when I studied abroad, and had the opportunity to go see what Hazel does in her everyday work. And she operates out of this island called Matatapu, which is right off the coast of Auckland, and it's about a 20-minute ferry ride out there. And so a couple days after we landed, we headed out to Matatapu via the ferry. And as you can see, it wasn't the nicest of days, but it's actually a really beautiful ride over. You can see the whole city from the island, and Matatapu is actually connected to another island called Rangitoto. So you actually take the ferry to that first island, and then I had the brilliant idea of Chris and I, my husband, walking across both islands. Sounded super fun. It downpoured to no avail. Oh my gosh, it was maybe the biggest rainstorm I've ever been in any time in my life, and we walked in it for about 3 hours. So we arrived to lots of helpful information, like today's weather is not good, and they also had a lot of signage about some of the things we would see on the island, because both Rangitoto and Matatapu are completely pest-free. So really New Zealand's first stage of some of these pest elimination goals was to set aside these safe haven islands for the birds. And Matatapu was among the first, where they wiped out absolutely every mammalian predator, and really created the safe haven for a bunch of bird species to thrive there. And so they have these traps set up just to make sure that they're continuing to be successful. As I mentioned, you can just jump on the ferry from Auckland, so they constantly have to watch out for rats invading the islands. And so luckily the next day, got quite a beautiful view of the islands. And as you can see here, Matatapu originally was mostly, or not originally, but had been agricultural land for a long time. And so when they wiped out all the pests here and created this safe haven, they had to rebuild a lot of native forest as well. So you can see behind the cows these really dense patches of forest that they've created. You can think of the fence as keeping the cows in or keeping the forest in, depending on what you're focused on. But to Hazel, it's really amazing to have this entirely protected forest. And actually, the pasture land turned out to be really useful for some species like the takahe that like having these meadows. So it wound up being a great decision for them to have this mixed land use system. And they also wanted it to demonstrate that these birds can recover in realistic environments like that are found on the New Zealand mainland. So the New Zealand mainland isn't all forests. There's lots of forests. There's tons of agricultural land. It's a huge base of the economy. And they wanted to show that this mixed land use could also support these species. So there's Hazel on the bottom right there, and her intern for the summer. And they are setting up a chick cam to face a nest and try to figure out what's going on with some of the chicks in Matatapu. So for many of these species that they brought over to these islands, they just thrived without predators. Nothing really had to be done. Simply without the predators around, they could just absolutely take back the land. For animals like the shore plover, it's been a little bit more complicated. There are only about 200 of these left in the wild, and they think that something else is getting to them. They don't know if it's disease or aerial predators coming after them, but they're trying to figure out what's going on and help rebuild this population. And as you can see here, they are really trying to watch out for these rats, because I have this quote from Dave Houston, who was helping out with another island very similar to Matatapu, where they had rebuilded a population of shore plover from 10, bringing in different species or different birds to kind of build up the genetic population. They eventually got up to 100, and a single rat wiped out 90 birds and just moved from nest to nest. They are just so vulnerable to rat predation that it took them back down to 10 birds and deleted 6 years of work in an instant. And so basically this entire species could be wiped out by a couple of rats on these islands. So it's really important for Hazel to try to figure out what's going on with them and how to support them. And so the next stage in New Zealand of kind of taking this safe haven model to the next level is building these fenced off sanctuaries. So this is Tapanui, which I went to visit, which is basically an entire peninsula. They built a really long fence and blocked off everything beyond it. And they didn't completely wipe out pests, but they reduced the numbers enough that birds are quite well protected there. And pulling up to the gate was really exciting for me, because I felt like we were entering Jurassic Park. And in some ways, it is like you're stepping back in time. All of a sudden, there are these really old growth native forests and all of these species, and the sound just hits you the second you go through, which I tried to add in here and it doesn't seem to be working, but that's all right. And so the fence is super cool in and of itself. It goes really deep into the ground. It curves up, but it also curves around because some of these predators are what they call perimeter runners. So they'll just run along the perimeter. And if they follow this perimeter all the way through, they'll wind up in a trap. So they won't actually dive off into the land. They just keep following that perimeter right around. So pretty clever there. And this island just gives a lot more space, basically. And the islands, this peninsula, the islands are really fantastic because it is more difficult for the mammals to get out there. But the peninsula allows for a lot more native growth and just a lot more space to be blocked off. By cutting off one single piece of land, that fence is really small and it blocks off an entire stretch of land that can be protected. And it's also open to the public entirely, so they let people come in. One of the most popular beaches in the area is there. Chris went surfing there. You can go for a walk in the woods. And there's also agricultural land, so it's not like completely separated out. They really want people to connect with these species and see that birds can be a part of the everyday life. And this is just kind of hilarious. On the left, they have, they want to attract more seabirds to this safe haven. They want them to nest here because there are fewer predators. So they have just set up these like fake seabirds that play sounds that sound like seabirds to try to draw them in to the ocean. And the guy that was showing me around here gave me the binoculars and he was like, do you know what that bird is down there? And I was like, oh man, I gotta figure out what this is. And I looked at it for like 10 minutes and he was like, they're fake birds, they're not real, okay? Like, just stop. But we did get to see some real birds, which were really exciting. A little blue penguin that had stolen the nesting box of a gray-faced petrel to the right. And so they've been pretty successful at drawing in some of these species. And now the next stage that New Zealand is taking, as I mentioned, is this entire countrywide goal of predator-free 2050, which is a little bit of a misnomer. There'll still be mammalian predators in the country. Cats and dogs are actually a huge problem, but that's not one the government wants to touch for pretty obvious reasons. People have them as pets. They love their cats and dogs. And so they just have a lot of signage like you'll see on the right, trying to get people not to bring their pets into some of these more protected spaces. But they are hoping to wipe out those three main animals, possums, rats, and stoats, in really the next 30 years or so. And this is not without contention in the country, obviously. Some people are opposed to the very idea of killing at all, impacting any of these species in that way. Some people are opposed to, they think they're coming after their pets' next, and they're worried about that. And other people are opposed to some of the strategies that they use. So one of the main strategies that they have for getting rid of these predators is using a toxin called 1080. And so this sign is actually for a different rodenticide. But it's essentially, the main one they use is 1080, and it's a rodenticide that they add onto these baits. And people seem a little bit better with the use of it on the ground. They're pretty much okay with that, but they also do these aerial distributions that a lot of people are quite frightened about. The idea of poison raining down from the sky obviously is very emotive. And 1080 is a toxin that has been banned in the US since the 1970s with a couple of agricultural exceptions. So their concerns are really understandable. The science literature that I encountered and officials in the country have found that it's really not a threat to public health. It kind of targets certain species specifically. One threat that is very real is that dogs are really vulnerable to it, so that's a major concern. But it targets mammals more so than birds, so that's part of the benefit in using it for these distributions. They also are very careful about where they spread it. I think previously that was not so much the case, but now it's really isolated to certain regions. And the helicopter use is really important for times where the rat population just comes out of control. And those are somewhat difficult to predict, but basically if there's enough food in a given year, they will have these population booms, and the helicopters can respond to that. And they can also get to New Zealand's really mountainous and rugged. They can cover terrain that people could not cover on foot to distribute it. So to get to this really big goal, 1080 is pretty crucial, but it's definitely controversial. And the reason they're willing to go through all of this effort is because birds aren't just another category of animal in New Zealand. New Zealand is really all about their birds, as Chris Gaskin said, one of the people I spoke to. New Zealand is the land of birds. They're really special. They have this deep connection. Another person said, as you can see, there's a different bird on all of their banknotes. And it's really tied into their national identity. Another person told me, this is the fabric of who we are, is our wildlife. And our wildlife is birds. And if you think about the fact that most other countries, what they call themselves reflects the name of the country. And in New Zealand, people call themselves Kiwis. They really connect with these birds on a different level. And so on my last day on Matatapu, I had a really special opportunity to get to see some Kiwi birds in person. They were bringing in a couple from a neighboring island. They try to mix up the genetic populations between the islands from time to time, and they minimize that as much as they can. They don't want to disrupt the individual birds who are doing really well, but they do want to make sure that the populations are robust. So they were bringing in 4 Kiwis. There was all this panic. We had to find nesting boxes for them. I was freaking out. I was so excited. And we set up these 4 nesting boxes. You can see in the bottom right. One side is completely blocked off. The other is covered with leaf litter because they bring in the Kiwis. And also they have a camera facing it. They try to capture everything and love to go through the footage later. They bring in the Kiwis in these little boxes during the day. Obviously that's when the ferry's running, that's when they can get them over there. But Kiwis are nocturnal, and so they try to create a really safe environment for them. So they have a very brief ceremony when they bring over the Kiwis, and they have some of the indigenous people of New Zealand present as well, the Maori. And then everyone says a few words. People get to see the Kiwi. No one's really touching it except for Hazel, and she's really careful with them. A couple of them that they brought out weren't happy, so they immediately put them into the nesting boxes. But they basically take them out, show them around to everyone, and then set them into these boxes so they can be in their new home. And on the next slide, I'm going to show a video from her showing the Kiwi around and just read the last passage of my thesis. Get going. After a few hours, the guest of honor arrived. 4 Kiwis, just as Speed had predicted. Other conservation rangers on the island and Maori representatives slowly made their way down the steep pathway to the spot Speed had selected in the forest. After a few words from the Maori, Speed said a few words of her own and brought the birds out of their transport carriers. Sunlight cut through the forest leaves, making the Kiwi blink with sleepy, confused eyes. Speed carefully held them against her chest and let each person take a look before lowering them into the release boxes. A dozen or so people stood in respectful silence, peering at the Kiwi with awe and excitement. Even though Speed didn't understand the Maori words that were spoken, both women had said essentially the same thing. "We wish you well, little birds. We respect that this was traumatic for you to be uprooted, but we hope you will be safe here." Safety for the kiwi comes at a high cost, from the mammals that must die to the enormous effort across each island, sanctuary, and now the entire country. But for many in New Zealand, each island, sanctuary, But for many in New Zealand, this brings them closer to creating the type of place where they want to live, closer to protecting the very heart of their natural world. For speed, it really all boils down to a single decision. Do we want New Zealand to be the home of rats and stoats and ferrets, or the home of kiwi and tieke and shore plovers? We have to make a choice. And that's the end. Thank you. I'm happy to take any questions.
Come on. You kind of mentioned this in this version of the presentation, but maybe you could say a little bit more about it. I'm curious if there are other invasive species or other kind of things that they think might, or yeah, I guess like, you know, if they do get rid of all of the mammals, are there other concerns? Like what's the next frontier of conservation?
Yeah, that, I think it was Mick Clout, one of the conservation biologists I spoke to, that said, and as if anyone heard Eva's presentation earlier today, in a lot of environmental situations, it's that like cut by many deaths situation where there's so much coming at them. It's habitat loss, it's like people infringing on their space, climate change, all of these things. And he said, in New Zealand, it's really simple. It's about these mammals. And if we get rid of them, most of those species will be able to rebound without much assistance at all. So while the poison thing is really scary, basically if they were able to do enough of that kind of distribution at once and then lay many traps to try to keep up with it, they feel like they couldn't, that's why they're announcing this goal. They feel like they're ready to make a push where that's possible. And they think even though they're only taking out those 3, that would be enough for most of these species to recover in huge numbers. There's like mice, there's many other things on the island that are too difficult to control. And even within these, they said like the possum is much simpler than the rat. Rats are known to be able to survive. But they feel like they're at least close to being able to make this goal a reality, and they think it would be really effective. For some populations, like the shore plover and actually the kakapo, where their numbers are so small and they are so poorly adapted for any mammals, they might still struggle with like cats and dogs even being around. But for the majority of them, they feel like this is really all they need to make a comeback.
You did a really nice job, and I wanted to ask what made Hazel Speed Hazel Speed?
You know, I could write a book about Hazel Speed, I think. I had a really nice moment on the last day of my trip where they actually had, I think, 8 volunteers this summer trying to help them figure out this shore plover problem, because almost all the other species they brought in, like I said, are just doing really well. But this one, they just have no idea what's going on with it. And on the last night, we all kind of sat around the living room and we were just sort of sharing what led us to be interested in these issues, what we'd like to do. And she sees the world, like she wants to live in a world of birds. Even at Matatapu, she can't stand the agricultural land. She's like, I'm a forest girl. I just want to be in the forest. And so I think she just grew up in the outdoors and grew up hearing these bird sounds all around her. And it's really heartbreaking to her that that's not something she hears regularly on the mainland. And I was just really impressed. I'm not sure exactly how old she was actually, but following her through the woods was really embarrassing and humbling and amazing, because she was just so comfortable in there and had a knee brace on. And I asked her about it and she was like, don't worry about it, it's fine. So I think she just really has that outdoor connection, which so many people in the country do. And I think that's why it's even a possibility that the extent of the number of people that swerve their cars to hit possums. They joke that that's the national sport, is trying to hit a possum with your car. So many people consider them enemies and just want the birds to thrive. They're really connected to them. So I think people like Hazel are incredibly special, but more common there just because of that connection.
That was an interesting presentation. I was curious, what's the life expectancy of a kiwi?
Of a kiwi bird? I don't know, actually. That's a good question. I was trying, it's really hard to avoid focusing on kiwis. I wanted to explore some of these different species that get a little bit less attention. The kiwi and the kakapo are kind of, they have Twitter accounts, they have followers, people love them. The shore plover doesn't get much. So I'm not really sure about the exact specifics.
I had a question about the use of traps. Are they practicing bounty conservation? In other words, is there a fee offered to eradicate the invasive species, and the public are participating in that?
I don't know if there are necessarily bounties, but it is incredibly like people in their backyards, school trips. It is, obviously the conservation trip that I did was through the university that I was attending. So I don't know if there's necessarily a bounty, but it is incredibly common.
You mentioned that the use of the toxic 1080 is it's toxic to mammals. Some of my favorite people are mammals. Is there any concern about that?
Yeah, so that's definitely where the concern lies. They kind of will say that as a benefit of it. Oh, it doesn't target our birds, which is something many people are concerned about. They say most of the science that I read, again, pointed to it being safe at the levels that they're using. So I think part of why it was banned in the US was the levels that it was used and the type of baits they used to use. It disintegrated really easily. It was called carrot baits, so I think literally using carrots, and they would just fall apart. And so it was harder to manage where exactly it fell. Of course, they have these, the guy said it's like cereal, basically pellets now that are a little bit stronger. They still readily dissolve in water, and that's how they get rid of them. But they're a little bit stronger, so they can be really specific. They use a tiny, tiny amount. One person I spoke to, and actually this kind of relates to like Tom's question about asbestos, about long-term low-level exposure. People are also concerned about that. Maybe I'm not eating a pellet, but what if they're around for so long? And he basically said the active compound is in black tea. And he was like, most people drink black tea every day, doing okay, which that was more anecdotal, but I think it's a naturally derived compound. And so they think at these levels and where they're spreading it, again, mostly like this rugged mountain terrain at this point, not like dropping it over cities, that people aren't really exposed to it in any measurable amount.
I'm assuming rats originally got to New Zealand on ships as, stowaways. And rats still travel on ships. And I wonder what they're doing to make sure that that there isn't this sort of regular reintroduction.
Oh, definitely. I think that's a huge concern. Some of the species, like the possum was introduced intentionally. The stoat was introduced intentionally to kill other species that had already been introduced intentionally. But the rats are, like the world's greatest stowaways and kind of show up everywhere. It's definitely a concern, but I think when they say predator-free, I think they mean really at such low volumes that the birds are able to recover. And I don't know exactly what they have planned for that. I do know when we landed in the country, they sprayed an insecticide on the plane before they allowed us to leave, which also kind of freaked me out. But I think they are more willing to do some of these measures to help protect their environment than other countries. They're really proactive about it. So I don't know that there's a plan in place for that. I think they're really just trying to see at this point if they can even lower rat numbers at that scale. That's really the one animal that they're not sure if they have the resources yet to get there.
Sorry, I have one more question. On some other islands, they're trying other things like gene drives and stuff to kill rats. Are they considering that method?
Yeah, so there's part of Predator Free 2050. I didn't really describe it, but they have these projects that they're funding different communities around the country. So they have 5 projects that they're funding right now that are just taking kind of like the fenced-off peninsula idea where they're protecting various patches in different ways and really supporting these huge community efforts. But they're also funding a lot of scientific research to try to develop new technologies. They're trying to look into different toxins that maybe are like really species specific and wouldn't impact humans at all, trying to dispel some of those concerns. And they're also looking into genetic tools. New Zealand is notoriously very anti-GMO and gene editing. So one of the researchers I spoke to said it's hard to focus on this when it might get blockaded if you're successful. But I think that's really an international question, and that's another thing someone said to me, that they're going to kind of see how that plays out in the international sphere, because it's come up in conservation many times and no one's really done anything on such a large scale. So they're kind of waiting to see how that unfolds and whether they'll be a part of it.
Okay, once again, thank you so much.
Yeah.
All right, as we do a quick computer switch, we will be getting to the last event on the program, which is a premiere of the student films. And if you'll excuse me for a moment while we try and get it all to work, we should be